My role at the MPAA is Chief Technology Policy Officer, and as Professor Hoffman mentioned, I have a background in technology policy, but prior to that I did software development for a long time. So been in the technology camp as well as in the entertainment camp for a while now. And so I have a little understanding of both, and I'm trying to bring that together to hopefully make some progress in this area and come to some good solutions. The DNS filtering idea was already well established when I joined MPAA about a year ago. I came in when there was a legislation that was being discussed called COICA, the Combating Online Infringements and Counterfeits Act. And DNS filtering was part of that. And then it then emerged this year in the Protect IP Act and the Stop Online Piracy Act, PIPA and SOPA, that we've all heard so much about over the past couple of weeks. A very interesting couple of weeks, I must say. So I think, that we have to start this debate, I guess, by first pointing out that despite what your views might be on the measurements that have been done to try to determine how big piracy is online, or how much of the internet use is dedicated to traffic for illegal content, I think there's no question, and there is widespread agreement, that it is a big problem. And I think that's come to light over the past week, is that everyone involved in this debate has agreed this is an issue that we need to address. So the question is, how do we address it? And in PIPA and SOPA, there was a really kind of a multifaceted approach to deal with this problem. And it involved not only DNS filtering, but it involved addressing search results, taking these rogue sites out of search results through search engines like Google and Bing. It involved a follow the money approach, so that you would ask payment processors and ad networks not to service these rogue websites and therefore dry up their money supply. And then, of course, DNS filtering. So DNS filtering is part of this mix, I think, because you not only want to avoid having these search results come up and stop the money, but you want some indication to the end user that when they try to go to these sites, if they know about them from some other source, that they've gone to a place where they shouldn't be. It's an illegal site, and it has been deemed such by courts, and it'd be nice if there was a mechanism to let users know that when they try to go to these sites, right? So that's the high-level concept, and as Leslie noted, I think, or demonstrated in her presentation, from a technological perspective, that first communication, and when you try to access a site, is generally with DNS. That's kind of one of the first steps that you take to find out where the website is, what is the IP address, and that would be possibly an efficient way to stop that communication at the very first step. So I think that just explains why DNS was in the mix to begin with. And about this multifaceted approach, I think you have to realize that the idea here was that if you did all of these things, you would create a virtuous cycle. Basically, you would, by taking the search results out, drying up the money, and giving users an indication they were going someplace they shouldn't be, you would allow the legitimate sites to raise up the search results. More traffic would be going to them, which would in turn motivate content providers to make more content available on better terms that would be more convenient for users. It would be my hope that new business models would emerge from that, and we would have a very different entertainment ecosystem on the internet. So that is the vision. It kind of the thought was to break the chicken and egg problem, I think, because there's definitely a problem with content providers on the business side saying, how can I put my content on the internet because it's going to get stolen? And they have a point. And I think if we work together, we can solve that technical problems too. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about what was wrong with PIPA and SOPA. So circumvention was one of the first issues raised. And out of circumvention, there were security issues that were mentioned as a possibility. And I think Leslie hit that when she described how, if you want to circumvent DNS filtering, there's some pretty straightforward ways to do that. And some are very simple. So let's go through some of them. If you happen to know the IP address of the server you want to get to, you can type that in your browser and you can go to the site, right? So you don't have to use DNS at all. You might use a DNS a web browser plugin. There's one called Mafia Fire. There's probably others available now too, where you'd be able to have basically a list of the blocked sites cached locally inside your browser, so that your browser kind of does the IP address translation for you. And again, not really using the DNS system, because the plugin helps you get the addresses that you want to go to the pirate sites. And finally, you can change your DNS server. You can actually go into the settings, or a piece of software could do this for you, and the settings would be changed, and you would be using a DNS server, and that has very serious implications. Because if you don't know what you're doing, if you don't happen to go to a DNS server that is legitimate, you might go to a rogue DNS server, and then you're putting yourself at risk by potentially being redirected when you want to go to your bank or some other very secure institution. You're directed to a forged site, and you could hand over all sorts of information to them unknowingly. So that's, I think, a large part of the security issue that was raised just on DNS filtering alone. Well, then there's DNSSEC. So with DNSSEC, there were other issues mentioned. And with DNSSEC, and again, as Leslie pointed out, when you do a redirect with DNSSEC in place, you're essentially breaking DNSSEC. I think that was through the debates over this last year and early this year, was well acknowledged by the content community and others who had brought it up. So it's just not, when you do that as an ISP, you're potentially breaking the trust. You are breaking the trust in the system, and it's not a good thing to do. There was a long period of time where the entertainment community continued pushing filtering despite that fact, and I was at NPA during that time. But that's more of a decision of legislative strategy than technology policy. So that's what happens in DC sometimes, but it does usually come around, as it did. And that was taken out of the bills, such that you didn't have to redirect. So if you don't redirect, what do? Excuse me. Well, NX domain, which is the domain doesn't exist, is not a good answer either, because that actually breaks DNSSEC too. So the proposal was pushed forward to return, there's a response code for DNSSEC which says, we're just not going to give you this address. It's like a refuse for policy reasons type of response. And that was the suggestion at the end of the PIPA-SOPA debates that ended quite abruptly over the last week. Excuse me. So, would that have worked? Well, engineers, a few engineers who are very involved in DNSSEC still had serious concerns about that. And they're documented to some degree. My impression, after having some debates with them, is that there is some software that wouldn't respond properly to even that response. Specifically, I think they mentioned Windows Server. When you had that type of response, would eventually kind of give up trying, I can't speak to the technical study they did specifically, but it would kind of give up trying to use the particular DNS server that it was you trying to use, and it would go to another, and maybe it would just end up giving up on DNSSEC altogether. So it was not a good result based on the test they had done with Windows Server. So the response to that was, well, that's very possible. We didn't really go into debating that a great deal because of the events of the last week or two, but if that were the case, the response would have been, well, Windows puts out patches every Tuesday. This is something that they are obviously not, in the view of engineers that we had consulted with, we're not doing according to spec, and this should be addressed. They should fix it. And if that happened, then this could be a result that would not break DNSSEC. And if a user tried to go to the website, they would just basically get back some response that would be appropriate, saying that we're not going to give you that address. Check I'm doing on time here. Okay. Okay, so is that an ideal solution? It's not. There's no question that it's not. It's trying to use existing technologies in place to efficiently stop access to these sites. Could we do it better? I think we could. And that was really kind of the hope from the beginning when at least I joined MPAA, is that there's got to be a way to potentially address DNSSEC or creatively find a solution to leverage the technology to give users an indication that they've gone to a site that's illegal. And I think that the response from the engineers that we had dealt with over the past year or so was that that was a non-starter, at least with regard to DNS. And that was kind of unfortunate. I think that kind of stymied the debate a little bit. I'm not saying that that was the only problem in the debates, because they weren't necessarily healthy debates over the last year, but it was part of it. And I think that now, given the recent events, we are in a situation where we're going to come back and take a look at this again, and hopefully come up with new mechanisms. Whether it involves DNS or not, I'm not sure. But it's a good, the general concept was right. You need a way to inform consumers that they've gone to a site that's illegal. And just following the money and addressing search results doesn't do that. So I have hope that DNS could be involved, but exactly how is really unclear at this point. And if it is, what are the concerns? Well, there's due process concerns to make sure that courts have actually reviewed this and made a judgment according to good rules of due process that our system, our legal system, is based on. I don't think that's really what we're here to discuss. I think that's something that can be addressed in the legislative process, and I have faith that it would be. There's an issue of integrity of the global naming system and the fragmentation of the internet, because you have different naming systems in different countries. It's a legitimate concern. And that relates as well to internet governance, is if we do this, are other countries going to do the same and maybe not do it with the same due process and use it for means that we would approve of? That's a concern too. And you might ask, does it even make sense to try to use technology to solve this problem? Just because people can always work around technologies. Well, it's a good question. These are all good questions that I think have to be addressed. My general response to all of them on behalf of MPAA is that we need to work through internet governance bodies to address the concerns. We need to work through Congress to make sure due process is in place. And we need to realize that there's always going to be a game of cat and mouse with regard to law enforcement. That's just the way law enforcement is. You start to enforce a law and there's going to be workarounds, and you have to adjust, and you have to come up with new mechanisms, and it's never done. And DNS filtering was never expected to be the killer solution, that it was going to absolutely stop people from getting to websites. In fact, I think that it was well acknowledged that that's really not what you want to accomplish with a solution like this. You don't want to cut them off such that people have to go to extreme measures to circumvent. There's going to be those that are circumventing. We just want to address those who would do the right thing if they were given some indication that they were doing the wrong thing. Okay? So, as I mentioned, there was a State of the Net conference this last week, and I mentioned there, I'm working very hard to move forward in this debate and to work with the DNSSEC community and adopt DNSSEC, and hopefully we'll find some forums where we can creatively address this problem with the ideas that I mentioned here.